So thank you very much for inviting me to come and see you today. It's always really good to be asked to come and speak to groups such as yourselves, because one of the things that I feel absolutely passionate about, I was just saying it's always really good for me to come and be invited to talk to groups such as yourselves, because one of the things that I'm very passionate about is how the psychological aspect, the emotional aspect of living with NETs can get a little bit lost along the journey, but it's something that is absolutely key and crucial to how you feel and how well you manage living with your condition. So thank you for letting me come and speak to you today. I work primarily with an organisation called Amend, which some of you may know of. And Amend works with people who have genetic NETs. And I'm guessing a number of you here will have genetic NETs and a number of you will have spontaneous NETs. And I'm also about to start doing some work as a counsellor with the NET Patient Foundation. So you may see me popping up in other places for those of you who get around. Okay, so what I'm going to do today really is I thought it would be good to just spend a bit of time acknowledging the very common feelings that can come up on your journey in living with a NET. One of the things in my experience is often very problematic for people is that we can get very British about how we deal with living with an ongoing condition. We're very good at not grumbling. We're very good at being stoic. And although these things have merit, sometimes when we push away difficult feelings, they can sort of fester and come up and come out in ways that we would sooner they didn't. So what I'm going to do to start with is just run through some of the more usual or familiar feelings that people find their way to me to talk about. And then we can spend a bit of time thinking about ways to look after yourself well emotionally when you're living with a NET. And I'm going to leave quite a lot of time afterwards for questions or comments so that hopefully this will be a fairly interactive event as well. Okay? Okay. So just a little bit of background about me from Amend. We've got about 1,000 members, and as some of you know, we provide free specialised telephone, Skype and face-to-face counselling. We've also, if you haven't found your way to us, even though we are directed towards those with genetic NETs, there is a lot of information on there about supporting yourself with all sorts of different conditions. And you might see me at sort of patient workshops and roadshows, and we have a number of information booklets on there that are very relevant for all of you here. And if you haven't found your way to our website, please do have a look. And something that we've also produced recently, which I'll talk to you about at the end, is about something called mindfulness, which some of you may have come across already, but might be new to some others of you. Okay, it's doing it again. Okay, one of the things that I feel very strongly about is a holistic approach to thinking about living with your condition. When you're living with a NET, it affects not just you individually, it affects your family, it affects your friendships, it affects you in the workplace, it affects you financially, it may affect you religiously or spiritually, how you work with your medical team, how you get on with them and the relationships that you build with them. All these things will impact upon you and be impacted in turn back with how you feel living with your condition. And how any one of these things is going will impact on how well you are able to live with your condition and vice versa. Okay, so something that comes up a lot when I'm talking to people is how you manage loss and disappointment. What do I mean by that? Well, it's a sort of particular way of putting something that may be familiar to all of you, that when you are diagnosed with something like a NET, or indeed any ongoing condition that you will live with over time, there's a sort of readjusting on the inside. We're very good at living with a sort of givenness, of an ongoingness about our lives. We don't like to necessarily dwell on the fact that we're mortal or life might be finite. And there's something about a diagnosis of a NET or other long-term conditions that brings us up short. We have to reckon with that. And as part of that, we also, with a NET, have to live with often an unpredictable outcome. There's often an impact too on how you think about it impacting on those that you care about. You can't hear me. Shall I bring this up a bit? I think because I'm quite short, I'm having trouble reaching the... Can you hear me better now? Yeah. Can you hear me better now? Yes. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lean. So I'm going to stand up a bit. I might look a bit odd. Okay. Okay. So one of the other things that it comes very much part and parcel of living with a NET is thinking about how it will impact upon those you care about, not just yourself. And the other thing that comes up a lot, and you may have experienced yourselves, particularly because NETs can take some time to diagnose, because they are more unusual. I'm aware that a number of you here might have had quite a journey towards diagnosis. It may have taken some time. Is that familiar to some of you? And as such, you know, we sort of grow up from when we're very young with the idea that we'll go to hospital, we'll get diagnosed, we'll get treated, and everything will be hunky-dory. And often there is something about the journey of living with a NET that this can be a very peculiar sort of loss. A loss of a sort of faith that there are those who know what to do, who've got the answers, who you'll be able to go to and say, okay, I've got this thing, and you'll know what to do about it. And often the thing about living with a NET that is very specific to your group is that you'll meet doctors and nurses and they will say, well, we could do this, that's an option, or we could do that. How do you feel about that? And you're bounced back into often having to make your own decisions, think about your own journey and path about living with your condition. Have to take up more control than perhaps sometimes we would wish. Often when we're unwell or we're feeling poorly, we sort of want to go, tell me what to do, I'll do it, and everything will be fine. Yeah? So that sort of sense of losing a kind of a, I suppose, more childlike relationship with doctors and nurses is a part of living with this sort of condition. Some of you are looking amused at that, and some of you are looking bemused, I can see. One of the other things that comes up is, you know, particularly when we take our health very much for granted, living with any ongoing condition means we sort of end up reappraising what we're all about. Am I still the same person with this that I was before it? I'm used to feeling quite strong and confident in the world. I feel a bit more wobbly, I feel a bit more uncertain. Yeah, these are the things that can sort of bring you up short sometimes. How do I move through the world now in this way? It can impact on your professional identity. One of the things that, you know, can be part of the journey of living with a NET is that there may be times when you choose or have to step back from your professional self, that just keeping going or keeping up with things can feel like too big a demand. So sometimes that loss of perhaps drive or energy to keep engaged with a very full work life is another loss. You know, we place a lot of our identity in what we do at work. Sometimes stepping back can feel another loss. So you can see when we add all these things up that one of the sort of rather unacknowledged aspects of living living with a net can be a lot of loss that's around. And sometimes just being aware of that and allowing it to be acknowledged can be quite helpful. The other thing that people often say when I talk to them is, how do you manage the anxiety that rumbles around all the time? I'm anxious all the time, just waiting for something else. I want to go back to when life didn't revolve around hospitals. I'm sure you've got incredibly good, all of you, at navigating hospital systems, of knowing when to ring which switchboard when, of making sure you've got hold of that particular nurse's number who will answer. You get really good at this. You get clever quickly. Bearing uncertainty is something that you will get fantastic at as you're living with a net. And that's the only way I can put it, really. It's a bit like you have to develop new psychological muscles. As humans, we're not very good at dealing with uncertainty. We like things clear. You know, we like to know how it is and we like to know where we are. Living with a net really challenges that aspect. So bearing uncertainty is something you'll probably get very good at quite quickly, but it is hard. One of the things that, as part of this journey, is I suppose an aspect of psychological growth, which is sort of a strange thing to say really, but when I talk to people who've been living with a net for a long time, one of the things they sometimes say is, I would never have wished to have this condition, but actually I am stronger in certain ways because of it. It does change you. It gives you different perspectives on yourself and others. And one aspect of that is finding a way of accepting what you can control and what you can't control. You can't control much of the progression of your condition, but sometimes it can be very helpful to take up an active control in terms of how you look after your body, you look after your relationships, you think about your diet. All these things make a difference in terms of thinking, okay, what can I take up a role in controlling and what can't I? You'll get really good at waiting. You'll get really good at waiting for appointments. You'll get really good at waiting at the results for scans. You'll get really, really good at waiting for people to get back to you. Okay? But it takes energy. Waiting takes a lot of emotional energy. And often in waiting, you have to find ways of bearing that process. It's another way in which I sometimes say you have to develop waiting muscles. And it's often difficult to know, but it's very important to consider. Is this something I need to wait for and I can wait? Or is this something I need to become more assertive and agitant and push for? And that's not always an easy thing to know, because one of the things of living with a net is that, like any long-term condition, all those aches and pains and tweaks and worries, one of the things that, of course, we do with a long-term condition, we go, oh, have I just pulled a muscle, or is that a thing? Yeah? And weighing that in your mind is very, very difficult. I'm sure you all know what I mean. Yeah? That sort of, oh, I'm feeling a bit funny. Is that just because I'm feeling a bit funny because I had something to eat last night that's made me feel a bit funny? Or is something kicking off? How do I know what it is? Is how I'm feeling, is this a hormone thing? Do I need to pay attention to this? Or is it just that I'm tired and I'm a bit worried? And all the time you're sort of bouncing back and forth this in your mind. And often there are no easy answers. But knowing yourself and what you're like can sometimes help you know whether you need to be approaching this from an emotional aspect or it's a physical aspect. One of the things that is incredibly helpful, but we do not naturally do as humans, is learning to live a little more in the present. We're terribly, terribly good at brooding on what has been, what has gone before, what should have been, what wasn't, what things were like. And we're also terribly, terribly good about worrying about what might lie ahead, most of which may or may not happen, and mostly we can't do a lot about anyway. We're very, very bad in the main at living in the present. But actually, if it's something you can find more of a knack of doing, when you're living with a net, it can make a really big difference to you. Right now, in this room, at this particular moment, nothing bad is happening. It's all right. We're all okay. Yeah? Right now. And sometimes there's a sort of pleasure in just going, oh, this is all right. I'm listening to someone, go on about the psychological impact of things, and I've had a cup of tea, and other people here seem quite nice, and we're all right. Right now, right this minute, we're okay. We don't know what tomorrow brings, or this evening, or next week. But being able to rest in the pleasure of right now being things okay is a real gift to yourself when you're living with a net. So anxiety and depression. I think, to be honest, this goes a little bit with the territory of having a net. Different degrees at different times, but it can't help but stir anxiety. It can't help but leave you at times feeling frustrated and upset. We don't want to feel like that, but I think it is one of the other symptoms, if you like, that often goes very unacknowledged when you have a net. How does that come out? Well, sometimes it'll be obvious to you. You'll know you'll feel anxious. You'll recognise it. You'll know that you're feeling low. But we're very clever at avoiding our feelings. We get very good at it over the years. And one of the things that I often say to net people, is there such a term? Net people is, you have a particular task when you're living with nets, which is they will often affect how you feel psychologically. And you will get very preoccupied by your bodily states. It's what we do when we have any ongoing condition. And sometimes what we do is we sort of locate our anxiety in a particular part of our body. We sort of get a bit over preoccupied by it. Do you know what I mean by that? It's sort of, we get a twinge or we get a worry, and then we sort of obsess about it. We go round and round it, and we can't quite put it down. And you end up thinking, oh, maybe I could just have another scan, or perhaps I could have another blood test. And it sort of feels very hard to put down a particular anxiety. Because we've started to focus on the body starts to then become a site, a locus, a focus for anxiety. And it's just worth sort of noticing, is this something that's actually going on that I need to pay attention to? There is a real, twinge or bump or problem here. Or is it that somehow that's where I'm directing my anxiety, which is about living with the condition overall? We are, of course, mind and body. I'm sure you can all remember back to when you were taking exams at school. And some of you will remember that feeling of dread before you go into the exam hall, and that sort of, fluttery tummy and feeling sick. We feel anxious, and then it comes out in our body. that gives you challenges when you're living with something like a net. And it's sometimes worth saying to yourself, okay, is this an emotional sort of feeling sick? Is this a psychological feeling achy, tired or worried? Or might it be a physiological one? You sort of have to weigh it up in your own mind, but don't discount the power of sort of psychological impact on the body. One of the things that I've already touched on is most of you living with a net will be living within wider family networks. You may have children, you may have partners. And one of the other anxieties and worries that goes with living with a net is that people say, I worry about my partner. I worry about how it's impacting on them. I worry about how my children are coping with it. It's an added worry for many of you. And sometimes it's just very important to acknowledge to those that you are close to that that's how you feel, and often allow yourself to be reassured. I'm just sort of curious how many people are here today with partners or other family members. Yeah, so there's quite a few of you actually. You've got a net as well, in a different sort of way. You live with it. It impacts on you, as a partner. You're not living with it in quite the same way, but you are living with it. It's having its effect on you. And that's very important for, when you're living with someone closely and one of you has a net, to try and be in it together. We're ever so good at when we're feeling under stress or pressure. It's that old adage, it's often the people we feel closest to that we're meanest to when we're feeling stressed out or unhappy. And I'm sure everyone here has sort of, given their partner a good kick or been a little bit unfair, when actually what you're really saying is, I'm fed up with living with this bloody condition. Yeah? It's what we're like. It's okay. There is no point beating yourself up about it. The important thing is being able to go to yourselves afterwards and go, yeah, that probably wasn't actually about you. That was probably more about the fact I'm fed up with this thing, or I'm worried about something, and it just came out in your direction. Okay? Sometimes anxiety and depression can come out in feeling just less confident. You feel more uncertain in the world. You feel less sure of yourself. And inevitably, when you get this sort of diagnosis, you can't help but be fearful about the future. And this is what I was talking about earlier, trying to find that way of always pulling yourself back to the present, saying, right now, right this minute, I'm okay. I am anxious, but right now, right this minute, I'm okay. And we touched on a bit of this before. Coming to hospital. I was sitting listening to the person speaking before me, and I thought how enormously impressed I was actually that you were all sitting there and facing terms like metastases and prognosis and things that sort of, when you first get into this system, it's almost like they appear in red neon lights, and part of you wants to stick your finger in your ears and go, la 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 la, it's not happening really. And it's not to be underestimated how much emotional energy it takes engaging with things that can be helpful, you're gaining knowledge, but can also be anxiety inducing too. So I suppose this is a heads up to sort of say, you might go home from here a bit tired. That makes sense to me because you've been doing a huge amount of emotional work managing your anxiety whilst you're hearing some of the things that are being talked about. Does that make sense to you? It's sort of like, it's helpful, it's really helpful coming and hearing this stuff, but there's another bit that's sort of like, oh God, why am I here? I wish this wasn't happening. Yeah? Anger. Anger is something that we're not very good at expressing. But actually it goes part and parcel with having this sort of condition. It's not fair. Why you? Why not someone else? It's all right to say that. We don't say it. We're very good, we're very noble, we're very sort of, stoic, again, that British thing. But actually, being angry about it, sometimes go and have a really good stomp about. Go and hit something that won't get hurt, but feel that you can, yeah? Be grumpy, be bad-tempered. You don't have to be heroic all the time. If you find yourself getting irritable with friends or colleagues, you've got a bit of a shorter fuse than usual, that's when you might want to say to yourself, is this something about that thing? Do I maybe need to sort of step back a bit and either talk to someone else about how I'm feeling, or just acknowledge that maybe I'm fed up with living with this for the moment? Sometimes it's also easier to feel angry than it is to feel upset. You'll probably recognise amongst yourself whether you are someone who temperamentally finds it easier to get cross about something, perhaps as a way of avoiding feeling more upset about it. We don't like getting upset because it makes us feel vulnerable, makes us feel a bit sort of weedy and a bit small. If we get angry, it makes us big. We feel sort of like powerful. I'm angry about this, yeah? But sometimes that can be as a sort of a bit of a defence against feeling actually upset and vulnerable. So just be mindful, which way do you go? This is a funny one which people are often very embarrassed about talking about, but it's feeling a bit envious of people who have other sorts of cancers. Particularly because mostly people will have heard of other cancers. I'm sure a lot of you here have sort of said, so what have you got? Blah, 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 blah. Sorry, what is that again? And you have to explain what you've got, explain how it might be different. And then people say things, so is it going to go then? What's your treatment? You end up saying things like, well, it's not quite like that. And then people don't know quite how to respond. And you're in sort of uncharted territory. Sometimes it can be much easier if you have a cancer that everyone's heard about. If you have breast cancer or a straightforward liver cancer. It's sort of, people know where they are, they know how to respond. Impact on relationships. We've talked about this a bit already, but you'll know that in your families, there are those people that you sort of suspect that when you talk to them about something to do with your condition, there are those who will respond in a way that is helpful and those who will respond in a way that is generally not helpful. Every family is like that. And what I can only encourage you to do in your families is to gravitate towards those people who you know will respond to you in the ways that you need. And to accept that actually, although it may be maddening and disappointing, sometimes family members just can't be who and how you need them to be. And often that's not because they don't care, but because dealing with this sort of thing sometimes brings up stuff for other people that they don't know how to respond to. You will all recognise this one, I think, which is the friends who underreact and the friends who overreact. Okay, so the friends who sort of go, so is it bad? How bad is it? And you say, well, I'm being treated, and I'm sort of living with something. They're not going to do anything right now. Oh, okay, that's fine. And then you see them next time, and you might have had an appointment, and you're sort of, a bit preoccupied with something, and you think, are they going to ask me anything? No, they're not going to ask me anything. It's like they've damn well forgotten. Cheek, because I don't forget. I live with this all the time. And it can be quite difficult. It can put a bit of a strain on some of your friendships. You've also got the friends who you probably know of who overreact. Oh my God, how do you cope? You are amazing. I could not cope with what you cope with. Okay, thanks. That's really helpful because I don't know how I do it either, but now I just feel weird. Okay? People don't always respond or react in the way that you need them to at one time. And again, going back to anger, it's all right to go and have a bit of a stomp afterwards and say, yeah, I really could have done with a different response there, but actually that's the one I got. Yeah? You don't have to be you don't have to be noble all the time. Friends are, as you know, flawed. And sometimes you have to sort of take it on the chin a bit, that they may not know how to respond to you in the way that you want. And sometimes you may not know what sort of response you want. Sometimes you might want to be made a fuss of. It's a big deal. And at other times you might think, I just don't want to get into it. So, you might change at different times too. Where I can talk a lot, because I spend a lot of my time listening in a consulting room. When I get in front of a microphone, I end up sort of making up for lost time and talking loads, so bear with me. I've already said this really, and this is something you just have to forgive yourself for, is sometimes we often behave the worst with those we are closest to and feel safest with. Yeah? And sometimes you might need to go back to the people that you love and say, yeah, sorry about that. It was a bit over the top. And for those partners who are here, and you might do that to the person who's living with a net, that's all right too. They don't get a get out of jail free card just because they're living with a net. Yeah? You're in a relationship. Relationships get complicated. Okay, guilt and shame. I'm going to have to sort of rattle on a bit, I can tell. But guilt and shame, this is a big one which we've already talked about. Feeling bad about having a net is something that people talk a lot to me about, how it impacts on others. I think this is particularly true if there's a genetic aspect, because it's a peculiar thing. You don't choose to pass it on to someone else, but somehow you end up feeling more responsible. And that's something that it's very important to acknowledge and perhaps work through a little bit. Ash, are you looking at me in a hurry up way? Okay. We often feel very bad too about struggling with difficult feelings. We much prefer to be brave. And often we feel very bad about being difficult. You might be difficult, as I was saying, with your partners. Sometimes you might come to appointments and you might be difficult. Yeah? Your consultant's trying to be helpful, but actually you don't feel like playing along. You just want to be difficult. You want more answers. You want something a bit clearer. Well, in the main, health professionals are grown-ups, and actually they should be able to take that on the chin. So it's really important that you don't go away and feel bad if you've sort of been giving what I would call your consultant a bit of a working over for not coming up with something better. Yeah? It goes with the territory for them. It's all right. For not coping, I often say to people when they make contact with me, try and feel that you can make contact with someone like me sooner rather than later. There's no virtue in kind of suffering or struggling for longer and longer until you reach popping point. Yeah, approaching someone like me or a counsellor in your local area or a GP and saying, actually, I think I might need to talk about this with someone. Do it before you're really on your beam end, because there's no virtue in that really. Yeah, give yourselves a break. The other way in which it can affect what I've talked about already is how it affects how you feel about yourself personally, professionally and financially. You know, some of you will be having to make big financial adjustments as part of living with this, and how we present ourselves to the world, what we're able to do in the world, has a big impact on how we feel, how robust we feel in it. And sometimes living with an ongoing condition, that can take a bit of a knock too. One of the things that I constantly get frustrated by is how good consultants are at saying, Oh, honestly, 6 weeks and you'll be up and around and you'll feel fine. And then people wonder why after about 6 weeks you might still feel like you've been hit with a truck. Okay? Everyone's recovery rate is different. And quite often I say to people, you know, take your recovery time and double it. Because one of the things that isn't always taken account of is that you're doing a physical recovery after things like surgery. But one of the most massive pieces of work is that you're also doing an emotional recovery. And an emotional recovery after something like surgery is at least as an important aspect of it. Because when you're in hospital, when you've had intrusive and unpleasant procedures and you feel vulnerable, it is absolutely exhausting. And you're holding yourself together and you're just hoping everything's going to be all right. And you're not in any sort of familiar environment with people that can really sort of look after you or things that you know. It's incredibly stressful. And we take time to recover emotionally too. So something I always say to people is surgery is always a trauma. It's a physical trauma, but it's an emotional one too. Let yourself recover. It does take time. The other thing that takes time is adjusting to a new normal. You know, if you have bits of you sort of cut out or, you know, cut around and rearranged, or you have to get used to a new medication or something being put into your body from a medication point of view, your body is effectively, for part of the time, going, what on earth has happened? Okay? And it takes time to work out how it's going to adjust. And it always takes a bit longer than you think it will. Even if you feel better, there's probably going to be times when you also feel worse. So letting something settle down, giving it a bit of time and not being too worried about the ups and downs is a really important part of recovering from treatment. Don't be brave. Honestly, it's entirely overrated. Okay? There is absolutely no virtue in it at all. You don't have to be heroic. Okay? Find those people that you know and trust and you can say to, I hate this, I just want to go home and I don't want it to be happening. Okay? Because actually, the sort of emotional energy it takes being very adult about it, you might as well just cut to the chase and just go, I don't want to. You know what? I don't want to do this thing anymore. It's just rubbish. Okay? Don't be brave. Let yourself be frustrated. You'll get really, really good at learning to be frustrated living with a net. You won't like me saying that, but it's true. Because there's a lot of ups and downs when you're dealing with treatment. Why is this happening? Well, it could be this, or it could be that. And you think, well, that's no help, I just want to know. They go, well, it sort of looks all right. Why don't you come back in a few weeks and have another blood test and we'll have another look at it then? And you think, no, I want to know now. So living with a sort of level of frustration and being able to sort of, what I would call, breathe and come back to it is a really important skill. And give yourself an emotional break. Yeah, we're not always very good at being kind to ourselves. Being kind to yourself when you're living with this sort of condition is a huge part of bearing it. Now I'm going to run through these quite quickly, but you will recognise which of these you fall into. And what I want you to do is make a mental note and go, yeah, when that woman was talking about this, this is what I do when I know my stress is getting a bit out of hand. Now, I'm going to attempt to use a visual aid, which could go horribly wrong, but I don't know how I'm going to do this with this microphone. One of the ways to think about yourself is that we all have what I call an internal coping capacity for stuff. Yeah, it's not a very user-friendly title, but this is our internal coping capacity for stuff. Now, You're all living with an ongoing condition, okay? Coping with stuff takes emotional energy. So this is how much your internal coping capacity is already being filled up by living with a net. Probably at least that much, okay? Other people who aren't living with nets, they aren't filled up in that way. They've got much more room. This is how we cope with stuff. That's when my car broke down this morning. That's when I had to go and see my elderly mother who locked herself out of the house. That's when my boss rang up to say that they needed a paper on their desk 48 hours and I thought they did. That's when my daughter came home to tell me that she needed something urgently for school the next day that I didn't have. That's when I realised I was getting cold. That's when some other miscellaneous stuff happened. Now, what I'm trying to show to you is, this is our internal coping with stuff container. For you, you already have a portion of your emotional energy being used up all the time just living with a net. And you need to know that, because it means you need to be really careful about what else you add in to here. Because it's when it starts to get to the top that we start to get that feeling of being overwhelmed. Yeah? Sometimes we get overwhelmed and we literally, like my water, we start to leak. Yeah? We leak in that way called crying. But sometimes it comes out in other ways. Yeah? We might not sleep very well, or it might come out in these sort of ways that I'm telling you about. So if you take anything away from what I'm talking about today, think about this internal container and think about the fact that your emotional energy that you have to take care of, a big portion of it is already being used up all the time just by living with a net. Okay? I'm really glad I didn't spill that all over this electronic equipment. Okay, so what are your stress signs? Okay, you don't have to put your hand up, but make a mental note. Sleeping problems. When we're stressed, we either don't sleep at all or we sleep loads. Yeah? Eating or drinking more or less than usual. Yeah? You're reaching for the biscuits, you're reaching for the chocolate, you eat bread till it's coming out your ears, or you just go off everything. You don't want to eat at all. Yeah? We go one way or the other. Becoming snappy or irritable. I'm sure none of you do that here. I know I never do. You can't relax. Sometimes one of the ways we carry our stress is we can't stop. We keep finding things to do. We clean out cupboards, we hoover the dog, we're constantly on the go. Feeling exhausted, and particularly if you feel exhausted with no particular reason, that can be a sign that your body's coping with a lot emotionally. Feeling preoccupied. You sort of get a bit obsessive about certain things that worry you more than probably when you step back from it should. Feeling overwhelmed, I'm sure you'll recognise that feeling. Feeling out of control. Getting tearful. Or feeling sick, headachy, tummy upsets, tummy aches, or funny sort of aches and pains. And one of the things that's really helpful is to sort of know what you're prone to doing. How do you carry your stress? Because actually that can also help you begin to differentiate between what might be an organic, physical or hormonal thing and what might be more likely to be an emotional thing. It's a very, very useful thing to work out when you're managing a hormonal condition. So here's my jug, yeah? And this is something to ask yourself a lot of the time and be mindful of. How big, how full is my internal container? Be aware of your own personal stress signs. And when you're starting to get stressed, you need to be kind to yourself. What sort of things do you need to do to look after yourself? Sometimes that can be something really simple. It's like saying, you know what, for the rest of the day I can't attend to anyone else's needs. I just need to look after myself. Go and have a hot bath, go and have a long walk, go and sit and stroke the cat, read a book, do whatever it is you need to do to let that sort of level in your emotional container settle down a little bit. Building a support network around you is one of the most underrated skills I think you can have when you're living with a net. Working out who's good for what is really helpful. And that's about working it out professionally, who's good for what, who can you ask for what, whose mobile number have you got, whose bleep have you got, sorry Ash. But, you know, knowing who you can ask when you're worried about something is really worth its weight in gold. Get the details of one of the CNSs that you think, actually, they're all right, I can talk to them. They won't mind, will you, Ash? Not a problem. And being able to just sort of check in with people and say, look, this is happening. Is that something I should be worried about or not? Don't be shy of doing that. It's really important. Building a support network around you personally is really key. You will all have people in your life that some of them are really good for practical stuff, but they'll run a mile if you go and say to them, oh, I've been feeling really low lately. They'll sort of get that rabbit in the headlights look. Okay? Knowing who's good for practical help and who's good for emotional help is really important. Auntie Joan may not be someone you want to sit and have a heart-to-heart with, but Auntie Joan may be someone who's really up for bringing round a casserole if you've been out all day and you haven't got the energy to do anything else. So working out, in the main, people want to help. You know, think sort of positively. People often want to help, but know what sort of help people are good for is really helpful for you. I mean, I've sort of covered these already, really, but I suppose I just keep making the case for the fact that, and this is why I think these sort of meetings are so incredibly helpful, because even if you don't particularly want to have a conversation with the person sitting next to you, just knowing that someone else is dealing with something very similar to you, even if it's not exactly the same, is very comforting. Do you know what I mean? That actually just being around other people that you can say, yeah, they're in a similar boat to me, and we're all getting on with it, and that's really helpful, is a really important thing. So even by coming here today, you are taking better care of yourselves probably than people who don't come to this. And you know, you will go through phases where you want to interact more with people dealing with a similar condition, and times when you don't want to interact as much. And that's okay too. It will come and it will go. Asking yourself, what do you need, is a really good skill too. What is it I need right now? Do I need more time for myself? Do I need to be able to have a conversation with either a health professional like my consultant or my GP or a counsellor? Do I just need some time out? Do I need rest? Now, when you're feeling overwhelmed, ask yourself, what do I actually need? And let yourself have it. Don't feel on your own with anything. You know, we can often get really focused on the sort of physical symptoms. And one of the things that I'd certainly encourage you to do is tell your clinical nurse specialists and your consultants how you're feeling. They really need to push this up the agenda sometimes. You know, they're often very good about asking how you're feeling physically, but tell them how you're feeling emotionally too, yeah? It's all a part of dealing with this condition. Don't write off talking to someone like me or finding a counsellor in your local area, yeah? Sometimes people say to me, oh, I don't know if it's bad enough. I don't know if I'm sort of, you know, doesn't it have to be really awful to come talk to a counsellor? No, I'd encourage you to come. You can come at that point if you like, but I'd encourage you to come before then too. Actually having a space to just offload what it's like living with your condition in your particular situation day in, day out can be really surprisingly helpful. So even if you're sitting here as a bit of a sort of counselling skeptic, don't write it off. The power of being able to talk about how you're feeling does make a big difference. Reach out to online groups. If you're someone who sort of likes being online, that can be really supportive. I'd also encourage you to give it a wide berth if you find it's just exacerbating your anxiety. Yeah? So sometimes those who are online are those who are really struggling with it, and you can really get infected by other people's anxiety. If you're finding that's happening, take a deep breath and stay off it for a bit. Okay? If you're finding it helpful, stay on there, but notice how you're responding and monitor it a bit. And that's just about me really, where you can find me. As I said before, I'm also going to be doing a little bit of work through the Net Patient Foundation, and if you felt it would be helpful to talk to me either over the phone or through Skype through that, you can make contact with me through the Net Patient Foundation. So thank you. I have talked a lot, I'm very aware, which is what happens when you let counsellors out of their consulting rooms. Thank you very much.